Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. In the last 100 years of popular music, we've seen the landscape change and evolve. From the post-war boom of rock and roll in the 1950s, all the way up to the reign of hip-hop in the 21st century, music seldom sits still. As a result, several acts will arrive on the scene, ascend to become the peak of their contemporaries, before dropping off, giving way to the next generation. And whilst many hang around for as long as they can, their later years aren't characterised by the same commercial success they once knew. However, there are a few acts who arguably have been able to break that all too familiar cycle, and there's one act in particular who, after 40 years of making songs, have not only managed to be remarkably consistent, but have also managed to adapt to the ever-changing pop landscape, scoring hit after hit after hit. And that act is, of course,
Pet Shop Boys.
The Pet Shop Boys.
Pet Shop Boys.
The Pet Shop Boys.
We're the Pet Shop Boys. We're the Pet Shop Boys.
Comprised of Neil Tennant and Chris Lowe, the Pet Shop Boys emerged amidst the synthesizer revolution that was taking place on the pop charts in the mid-1980s. Their love of dance and electronic music, combined with stellar production and lyrics, helped them grow to immense success in a short amount of time. In this multi-part documentary series, we'll be going through each era of the Pet Shop Boys' long and distinctive career to witness the highs, the lows, and all the quirky bits in between that helped make them so unique and so enduring. And there's only one place to start: the time period centered around their first album, Please. Our journey begins on August 19th, 1981, in an electronics shop on the King's Road in London. It was on this fateful day that a chance meeting occurred between Newcastle-born Neil Tennant and Blackpool lad Chris Lowe. Born in 1954 and 1959 respectively, the two came from wildly different worlds. Neil was working at ITV Books, and Chris was studying architecture at the University of Liverpool, visiting London to gain some practical experience in the field. However, one common bond they shared was a passion for dance music, and not long after, the two would frequently visit one another and begin writing songs, originally calling their duo West End. Dance music was in an interesting place by the turn of the 80s. The disco boom of the late 70s had come to a firm and swift end, and although there were still a few disco hits appearing on the pop charts in 1980 and 1981, the peak of the genre had certainly passed. In the rise of new wave sounds, dance music began to feature synthesizers and electronics more heavily than ever before. Breakout hits of this mould include Don't You Want Me by the Human League and Tainted Love by Soft Cell. With dance music adapting more to electronic sounds, this presented the newly formed West End with an opportunity to try and break into the ever-competitive pop market. But before all that, a name change was in order. Throwing out West End, the two became the Pet Shop Boys. But why that particular moniker? Well, according to interviews and their official website, the name derives from some friends who worked in a kneeling pet shop. Nothing more, nothing less. Settled on their new name, and with some songs already written and early demos recorded, they needed a producer to make those ambitions reality. By the summer of 1983, Neil had moved on from ITV Books and was now working as a journalist for the UK's leading pop music magazine, Smash Hits. One of his assignments took him to New York, where he was to interview the Police. This could have been seen as a lucky break, as around the same time, Neil and Chris had become fascinated with dance records made by the New York-based producer Bobby Orlando, more commonly known as Bobby O. Neil arranged to have lunch with the producer, and after hearing the group's demos, he agreed to help produce and record a selection of their songs, which would take place in 1983 and 1984. Many of these recorded songs are tracks that would eventually appear on the duo's albums, albeit sounding very different from these original mixes. Eventually, a single had to be chosen, and in April of 1984, that first single was West End Girls. But probably not the version you remember. The original mix of West End Girls shares many similarities with the more popular version, but it arguably feels more stripped back, more bare bones. It became a US club hit in areas such as Los Angeles and San Francisco, and a minor hit in some European territories, including France and Belgium. Back home in the UK, it was only available via import, and couldn't get past the barrier into the top 100. However, having their very own 12-inch single available on import in a trendy London record shop was a feat that thrilled the band no end, as that's how they were able to access much of the dance music that they held such a passion for. A second single, One More Chance, would also see release in 1984, but failed to chart anywhere, leading the pair to question whether Bobby O was the right producer for them going forward. After extensive negotiations, the Pet Shop Boys would leave their contract with Bobby O and sign with Parlaphone, a subsidiary of EMI Records, in March of 1985. Work swiftly began on a new single and crafting together what would become their debut album. On July 1st, that new single was Opportunities, and similarly to West End Girls, this first version wouldn't be that successful, only managing to peak at number 116 on the UK charts. Undeterred, focus turned to the album, and one producer in particular that Neil and Chris wanted to collaborate with was Stephen Hague. Having enjoyed his work on tracks such as Malcolm McLaren's Madam Butterfly, the boys would have to convince both their manager, Tom Watkins, and the label itself, EMI, both of whom had reservations. As a compromise, EMI greenlit a re-recording of West End Girls, to be produced by Hague as a sort of trial run. Slated for a single release in October 1985, this was a make-or-break moment for the Pet Shop Boys' sound and their success. Released on October 28th, the new version of West End Girls first entered the charts a couple of weeks after it hit shop shelves, first placing at number 80. Over the following weeks and months, it rose in the charts, before cracking the top 10 in December, and finally, in the January of 1986, the Pet Shop Boys achieved their first number one single. In just under 5 years, they'd gone from a chance meeting in an electronics shop to writing songs together, first recording them with a renowned New York producer, to now being signed with EMI and topping the UK charts. A dream come true for any aspiring pop act. The success wasn't just limited to the UK either, as West End Girls also topped the charts in the US. To achieve stateside success on your first single for a UK act is not to be sniffed at. Whether it could be sustained, only time will tell. Ultimately, the single would sell around 1.5 million copies, and to this day it remains one of the most popular tracks to emerge from the 1980s pop scene. New fans of the group could start catching them on television more regularly, including appearances on Top of the Pops, Saturday Superstore, and Wogan. As with any pop act, a follow-up single was issued on February the 24th, 1986, exactly a month ahead of the album's planned release on March 24th. Love Comes Quickly is such a rich song in terms of its lyrical content. A love story told amidst a swath of electronic soundscapes, Neil's crisp vocal punctuating every word. To me, it's one of my all-time favourite PSB tracks, though it didn't catch that same fever with the general public. Entering the charts the week after West End Girls finally dropped out of it, Love Comes Quickly would eventually peak at number 19, before dropping out of the charts entirely by May 1986. Whilst a top 20 placement is still very respectable, supposed fears of the group being merely a one-hit wonder could have been stoked around at this time. Internationally, the single charted higher in Germany and Ireland, where it reached numbers 17 and 13 respectively, but in the crucial US market, it was far from the top of the charts, peaking at number 62. Despite not replicating the astronomical success of West End Girls, the Pet Shop Boys were now all lined up to release their debut album, after several years of work. The LP was to be called Please, so in a jokey sense, you could go into a record shop and say, "Have you got the Pet Shop Boys, please?" How often that joke was made is up for debate, but it would begin a trend of one-word album titles that the duo still employ to this very day. Released on March the 24th, 1986 on vinyl, cassette, and the then relatively new CD format, Please would debut on the album's chart at number 3. Not bad for a group's first LP. However, this would prove to be the album's peak. By May it had dropped out of the top 10, but it would ultimately have a 37-week run on the charts, finally dropping out in December of 1986. It would resurface on numerous occasions in 1987 and 1988, and rather bizarrely, for 1 week in March 2018, it placed at number 65. What helped Please stand out amongst its competition on shop shelves was undoubtedly its cover. Bright white is the dominant colour, and on vinyl editions in particular, a tiny picture of the two lads is seen in the centre, with equally tiny lettering displaying the group's name and album title. In an era where album covers could be garish, cluttered and extravagant, this minimalism really helped the LP carve an image for itself, though not everyone involved was satisfied. The French distributor for the album completely changed the cover to include a much larger photo, and on the CD release of the album, the ratio of the photo hadn't been adapted to suit the smaller dimensions of a CD jewel case, leaving a result that the group never felt quite worked so well. Today, you can pick up Please in its original forms on vinyl, cassette, and CD, but there are also remastered options available, namely on vinyl and on CD. There's also a 2-disc release available under the Further Listening brand, which contains remixes, demos, and unreleased tracks from this era. Across its 10 tracks, Please had a lot to offer listeners both lyrically and sonically. Aside from the already successful singles West End Girls and Love Comes Quickly, there were several of the album's cuts that were just as memorable, such as the opener, 2 divided by 0, which tells the tale of two friends running away to seek out an exciting new life, and perhaps establish the benchmark for the kinds of storytelling we'd see from the duo in the future. Other highlights include Tonight Is Forever, Violence, and Why Don't We Live Together, but really, this whole album has a little something for everyone. Despite not setting out to create a concept album, the boys arranged the songs so that they would have a very loose story. A couple who ran away at the beginning, describe being in London, making lots of money, falling in love, the delights of suburbia, and so on. When listened to in that context, it provides a whole new experience for the album. But as is, Please is one hell of a debut, even just from the singles alone. Speaking of singles, with their first album being a top 5 smash, they started popping up more and more on various television programs, and fast began work on the third single from Please, which would be a familiar track for the pair, Opportunities. Having originally released the song as a single back in 1985 to little fanfare, rather than simply reissue the same music video, the boys went for a different approach. A brand new short film was shot, moving away from the moodiness of the original to something a lot more colourful and vibrant, utilising the accessible blue screen technology of the era. The album version of the song is used, which sounds more bombastic and grander compared to the relatively stripped down nature of the original, swapping out the moodiness for a sound that arguably matches the lyrics much more tightly. Depicting two guys attempting to make all the money in the world, Opportunities feels right at home in the Thatcher-led Britain that it came out in. At a time when greed was considered good, an ironic tongue-in-cheek song about making money almost felt unsayable, but this establishes one thing the Pet Shop Boys are never afraid to attempt: saying the unsayable. Having only reached number 116 with its original release, the reissue of Opportunities became their third consecutive top 20 hit, peaking at number 11, with the new music video getting constant play on a variety of music programs. Over in the lucrative US market, Opportunities also found great success, charting one place higher, giving the duo their second top 10 hit in the States. However, even though the reworking of one of their original songs had now performed much better at home and abroad, it still didn't chart as highly as they'd hoped. And for Neil, he would go on to say he always slightly preferred the original version of the song. Its atmosphere and moodiness lent into the true sadness of the song, he felt, that these two people were just down and out losers, who seemingly would do anything to make money, even if it would turn out to be all for naught. With 3 successful singles in the span of only 6 months, where could the Pet Shop Boys go next? Well, it was and still customary for pop acts to go on tour after the release of an album, to not only help promote it in its singles, but to also deliver a fantastic live experience for their fans. However, the Pet Shop Boys were unlike most pop acts. Their live presence on shows like Top of the Pops was rather minimal, which granted was part of their appeal, and in terms of the conventional touring layout stage-wise, they weren't too impressed. If they were going to tour, not only did they want it to be unique, but they also wanted it to be spectacular. In the June of 1986, they announced a tour of both Europe and America, but then promptly cancelled it. Given that they wanted to employ a designer from the world of theatre, and produce a show that was going to be lavish with costumes and various set pieces, the cost of doing so in relatively small venues was deemed too great, with some estimates from the duo themselves claiming it would have come to something around the tune of £500,000 in potential losses, money which, despite their success, they just simply didn't have to utilise. But now that there was no tour to plan for, their attention was now focused on releasing the 4th and final single from Please. Inspired by the 1984 Penelope Spheris film of the same name, Suburbia detailed a riot occurring in an old, wasted suburb, all together with imaginative lyrics, an instantly recognisable chorus, and a whole new level of production compared to what was heard on the album. Suburbia had been one of the last tracks recorded for Please sometime in early 1986, and due to the lack of time, the version you hear on the album is almost a straightforward re-recording of the original demo. It still sounds great, but it's arguably missing something. After friends, family, and fans kept commenting on how the song should be a single, the boys duly revisited the Suburban Hell with plans to give it a whole new lease of life. Julian Mendelsohn was brought in to help remix the track. Renowned for his own work on remixing Relax, an insanely popular smash hit by Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Finally releasing as a single on the 22nd of September, the new version of Suburbia was well worth the wait. It raced into the top 10, peaking at number 8, and despite not being a hit in the US, it placed within the top 10 charts all across Europe, performing best in territories such as Germany and the Netherlands, where it just missed out on claiming the top spot. The corresponding music video for Suburbia also became another Pet Shop Boys classic, depicting the duo in a Los Angeles suburb. Contrasted with the relatively derelict sights seen in areas of London, the short film helped hit home the harsh realities that could come with suburban life, particularly prevalent after numerous riots earlier in the decade, in places such as Toxteth in Liverpool and Brixton in London. As well as a standard 7-inch single, Suburbia's 12-inch release contained an extended mix of the track, dubbed The Full Horror. Not only did this release contain arguably the best version of the song, but amongst its B-sides, it would contain a track that would go on to become one of the most beloved tunes of the Pet Shop Boys, Paninaro. Observing a youth culture present in Italy, known as the Paninari, a track that would ultimately become known as Paninaro was born. Chris had written all of the music himself prior to this, and decided to have a go at recording his vocals for a change, listing off a series of words that have become instantly quotable for any Pet Shop Boys fan.
Passion, love, sex, money, violence, religion, justice, death.
As mentioned, it featured as the B-side to Suburbia, but also was released as a limited edition single, in Italy only. The boys admired the Paninari culture, with these youths adorning designer clothing such as Emporio Armani, whilst enjoying the pop hits of the day from artists such as Wham, Duran Duran, and Madonna. A music video was recorded, on location in Italy, featuring several members of the Paninari alongside Neil and Chris, but despite its limited single release, Paninaro would see life on an upcoming LP that would close out what had been an incredibly busy, stressful, but successful 1986 for the Pet Shop Boys. Released on the 17th of November, disco followed the recently growing trend of pop artists putting out remix albums. Given the Pet Shop Boys' attraction to remixing, a project of this nature was appealing, though reportedly it took EMI some convincing for them to release it. It was a 6-track album, with each cut being between 5 and 10 minutes in length. It contained remixes of the 4 singles from Please, as well as Paninaro, and a vastly unheard song, In the Night. A version of this tune had originally featured on the first single release of Opportunities, but given that record's failure, it could have been forgiven for thinking that this was a brand new track. Despite EMI's attempts to avert the project, Disco would perform beyond expectations, placing at number 15 in the album's chart and being certified platinum here in the UK, a high accolade for a 6-track remix LP. Disco is fondly remembered amongst the vast catalogue of the Pet Shop Boys, with future collaborator Stuart Price citing it as a massive influence on his musical tastes as a teenager. Remix albums would gradually become more commonplace too, with even mega artists of the day like Madonna getting in on the trend shortly after. By the time 1986 rolled into 1987, work had already begun on the follow-up album to Please. With 4 top 20 singles, a highly successful remix LP, and a largely growing fanbase all across the world, to think that the Pet Shop Boys had achieved most of this within a 12-month period is remarkable to say the least. This all arguably culminated at the 1987 Brit Awards, hosted on the 9th of February. Neil and Chris were up for 2 awards, Best British Group and British Single of the Year. Whilst in the former they lost out to 5-star, in the latter they triumphed over songs such as Sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel and The Lady in Red by Chris de Burgh, and went home with one of the most coveted awards of the night. Neil received the award from Boy George, though audiences may have noticed that Chris was absent. He had decided to stay home and watch the events unfold on TV. Regardless, this honour cemented them as a breakthrough force in British pop, a duo who not only fit within the current trends, but were evolving them, pushing new boundaries, and continuously experimenting with their songwriting, their music videos, and their performances. 1986 had been a monumental year for the Pet Shop Boys, where they went from not being known by many to becoming household names by early 1987. But there was no time for slowing down. The second album was well on the way, and the lead single was being primed for a release in June. Would this sophomore LP live up to the unprecedented success of Please? I mean, most follow-up records are consigned to the dustbin of history. Well, this one would turn out rather different, actually. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Jen Samantha Pringle, Kelly is Live, Tracy Smith, Hooks Media, Ben Freeman, Ethan Carberry Holt, The Welsh Lady, Bruce Danton, The Broken Kitsumanoid, and Cooking at Nan's and DIY, our AMTV staff members.